Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending today's webinar, How to Avoid Employee Theft, presented by Stephen Misrak of Dorfman, Misrak, and Thaler. Please be aware that there will be a question and answer portion today at the end of the webinar. To avoid frequent interruptions during the webinar, please type your questions in the question box located on the right of your screen. They will be answered in the order received during the question and answer portion. Additionally, an electronic version of this presentation will be emailed to all participants following the completion of today's webinar, and a recorded version will be available on the website for members only. Again, NJMGMA would like to thank you for attending, and I will now turn things over to Stephen.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody had a terrific Labor Day weekend, and hopefully this presentation will be a great kickoff to the rest of the year. So I guess we'll start with just what we're going to be speaking about today, which is how to avoid employee theft, and just some interesting facts that you should be aware of. That employee theft affects 70 to 80% of all doctor practices out there. In terms of monetary cost to a practice, you can figure it's probably about 5% of revenue. So just do the math as it relates to your practice. And it usually occurs in practices where there are 10 physicians or less, meaning that they're the smaller practices. And of course, the reason for that is because practices of a small size usually have less of an allocation of resources towards infrastructure and organization, and it's just easier to override those processes and procedures that are in place. And hopefully, as a result of today's talk, you'll be able to take away some opportunities to help limit that happening for you. And typically, the way a theft will occur is it's not like the Brinks truck is coming up and taking all the money away from your office. It usually happens over a period of time, and I'll kind of give you a case in point. So let's look at your practice, and let's just say we're in flu season. The practice is going crazy in terms of activity. Phones are ringing, and because it's flu season, a couple of people are out of your office. So all of a sudden, your front desk person, let's call it Jane, is talking to a patient, is in the process of collecting a copayment. Let's say it's $50, and Jane gets a call from you and says, "Do me a favor, I need to see you right away." And while Jane is collecting the money, she's also, is answering the phones on the call, asks someone to hold on, runs back to you. You tell her whatever it is you have to tell her. She goes back to her desk. The person's gone. Oh, and one step that I left out is when she runs back to you, she says, "Gee, I don't want to leave this $50 just sitting on my desk. Let me stick it in my pocket." And she runs back to you, runs back to her desk, continues with the day, never bothers to enter the money in the day sheet, forgets to put the money into a safe box, gets home, gets into her routine back at home, and then all of a sudden she's going through things, and she sees, wow, I had this $50. Where did this come from? And then she kind of puts two and two together, realizes that the money came from the practice, completely innocently, and says, "Okay, look, I got to make sure I put this money back tomorrow," and leaves the money on a dresser that night to make sure that she puts the money back. And the next day rolls by, and her son is late for getting off to school, so she's scrambling to get the kid off to school to make the school bus. Leaves the house rather, before taking the money. Comes to work, and no one says, "Hey, gee, Jane, you were out $50 yesterday. What happened?" And that becomes the opportunity for her to take some money. And then a couple of days roll by, nobody ever says anything, and she's off to the races. The thing that I would share with you is that many times these kinds of occurrences do happen innocently, and one thing leads to another where the person is now maybe has some financial difficulty, some medical bills or something happened, a big credit card bill, and now says, "You know what, I need some money to get through the month, and I'll just borrow the money from the practice, and I'm going to pay it back. I know I will." And nobody will know. It's what are we talking about for $50 or $100? Nobody will miss it, and that occurrence will then snowball to 50, 100, 500, 1,000, 5,000, you name it. And typically that's how these things tend to happen. The other thing that I can tell you just about people in general, in terms of our experience with them, is that initially it starts out as something that, gee, I'm just going to borrow the money. And then there's some sort of radical shift in their minds where no longer is it something that doesn't belong to them, but it's actually become something that they're entitled to. Gee, they're making so much money in the practice. I'm being underpaid. I work so hard. I'm really entitled to this money. And that's how someone who tries to take money from a practice begins to accept what they're doing, because as we all know, it's a horrible thing to steal money, right? Or steal anything for that matter. So it's kind of the progression, kind of the evolution, almost like Darwinism in reverse. And so, again, just trying to give you a little insight into people in general. So, so what does a thief look like? Well, this is Doris. This is actually somebody that doesn't look very menacing, at least from my perspective. I don't know about yours. And it could actually be somebody that could be a member of your family. So we're going to call her Aunt Doris. And that's somebody that you could be having over for Thanksgiving dinner. But of course, we all know that that's not your aunt. That's your spouse's aunt, right? That's from the other side of the family. But, I mean, that's what a thief looks like. I don't know if you read the papers recently, but there was a Little League that was in the Midwest of the country, and someone had embezzled the funds from a Little League. Imagine, little kids playing baseball, and somebody, stole all the money from the league. And that person that stole the money was actually a library clerk in town. So it kind of gives you a little insight as to, what somebody like that looks like. So let's talk about the profile of somebody that would steal money. Usually they're a trusted person. They've been around for a long time. They're tenured. And they kind of like to work alone. It's like the Lone Ranger kind of mentality. In the sense that they like to keep things very close to the vest, not share much information. Because, I mean, why is that? Because they have a deep, dark secret, right? They're stealing money, and they don't want to let anybody know what's going on. In 50% of the cases, the person that ends up taking the money is the receptionist, because the cash is the easiest to grab, right? And then, in, like 27, 25% of the cases, it's you guys. It's the office manager, the practice administrator. And so it's important for you, I'm glad that you're attending this, to kind of learn about ways of improving the office delegation of duties so that you're not looked at as the suspect, right? I mean, there's a television show called The Usual Suspect, and we certainly don't want that to be you, so I'm glad that you're able to kind of join us. In situations where you're dealing with larger types of losses, amounts in excess of 50,000, it's usually top management, because you need to have a more sophisticated group in terms of trying to take money from at a larger level. And more often than not, at that point when you're dealing with that, you need people to work together. So one of the things that they teach us in accounting, and by the way, we're a CPA firm that, as you might probably know, has a large experience base in healthcare. But what they tell us is that no matter how good an internal control system that you have, and we'll get into a good one in a little bit, collusion amongst the employees is always something that can overcome the best segregation of duty allocation. So if you have people working together to kind of override a system of internal control, it becomes very difficult to detect. But greed usually comes into play, and then more often than not, you can't catch them. Getting back to the profile of the employee, we talked about they're trusted, they're tenured, and it's kind of funny, but they work the longest hours, and they're never sick. They never go on vacation. You leave, you come in the office in the morning, they're there. Aunt Doris is there. You leave at night, Aunt Doris is shutting out the lights. So again, they're always there because they're always trying to cover up what they're doing. And as I kind of talked earlier about the case history, they usually start small. So here are some, crazy stories that I could share with you, and I call it Yes, It Happened. Believe it or not, it really did. So here are some ways that people have stolen money from practices. One is they write refund checks to fictitious patients. or they could write refund checks to patients but they, to real patients, except they cash the checks. They actually open a bank account in the practice's name and another bank account, another bank, and will deposit checks that were payable to the practice and then take the money out. Or they'll take the checks that were payable to the practice and just go to their friendly banker. And obviously this is where collusion outside of the practice would occur, or to a check cashing place, cash the checks and take the money. Again, it doesn't always have to be, cash coming into the practice, but somebody could pad their hours, give themselves an additional week of vacation, additional week of compensation. We've also seen people, because when you review your payroll report, you're always focused on the wages aspect, but as you also know, again, because most of you use a payroll service, you will also, Paychex or ADP will just tell you how much money to wire into them to cover the payroll, and then you more often than not just focus on the payroll or the gross payroll. But what about if they're also calling in expense reimbursements or loans to themselves that will also be reflected, not necessarily in the gross payroll, but will be reflected in the amount of outflows that come from your checking account into the payroll service. It could also be something as simple as not withholding money from the 401k that they have to match, and then having the company actually make the contribution on their behalf. Other things that we've seen is payments to fictitious employees, payments to fictitious vendors. Here's one for you: a situation where the office manager or controller had submitted a American Express bill to the doctor to sign for the practice, and instead of using that check payable to American Express to pay the practice's bills, they paid the bookkeeper's bills. We've also seen it with car payments. We've talked about how somebody could steal a co-payment. We've seen situations where accountants, where an accounting firm representing the client says, look, you need to pay your quarterly estimated income taxes in. You need to make a check for the IRS. Give me the check. I'll take it and I'll add the voucher and stick it in the envelope. And lo and behold, the accountant actually used that check payable to the IRS to pay their own taxes. It could be something as simple as forging the doctor's signature or whoever the authorized signatory's signature. Another situation we've seen is where, again, using the same American Express analysis, we present the bill with the, say, look, we need you to pay the American Express bill for the practice. Doctor looks at the bill looks good, signs the check, and then the bookkeeper then goes to another doctor, submits the same bill, says, here's a check, we need to pay a bill for the American Express. Doctor looks at the bill, says, yeah, this looks fine, I'll sign it. And what the bookkeeper ends up doing is taking one check and using that check to pay the office's bill, and then using the other check to pay their own American Express bill. Other things that we've seen is situations where where the person in charge of paying the bills will kind of agree to pay an inflated amount of the bill to the vendor, then the vendor ends up giving them a kickback outside of the office. So these are all real factual things that have happened. So how do people cover this up? So one is, again, and I strongly recommend that you don't do these things, obviously, because if you have loose internal controls, it makes it much easier to steal. But you should never write checks payable to cash, because, of course, that's much more difficult to track in terms of what the ultimate use of the funds was. Sometimes what somebody will do, especially if they're paying bills online, they'll, within their QuickBooks, they'll indicate, the first step, they'll indicate who the real source of the funds was, and then after the check is cut, they'll go back in and change the name of the payee to something that would seem more innocuous and less subject to detection. People destroying receipts. Another thing that we've seen happen is usually when you give somebody, when someone gives you cash, you usually give them, meaning the patient gives you cash, you're supposed to give them a receipt for a receipt of the cash, and usually those receipt books are pre-numbered. So if you don't give the person a receipt, and then there's no trail of of the money that you've actually received, and then they can stick the money in their pocket. More often than not, if the amount of theft that's going on within the practice is sizable, it will somehow impact the financial situation of the practice, right? Eventually cash flow will diminish, whether it's as a result of reduced inflow of funds or an excess of outflow of funds, and the practice will ultimately suffer. So what the bookkeeper or practice manager or controller might have to end up doing, so that people don't detect, that the bank balance is lower than it normally is they'll start to hold vendors' checks, so that the bank balance is, appears higher than it really is, because people will go on sometimes and check the, gee, what does my bank statement balance look like online? And then, of course, to me, the most egregious of all crimes that I've seen is where people are trying to cover up the fact that they're taking money and they start overbilling your third-party payers, whether it's Medicare, insurance companies, what have you. And that really can get you in a lot of hot water, because now you can then end up being involved in a criminal activity even though you had nothing to do with it. And that could create a whole set of issues for you. So these are some of the ways that people can cover up what they're doing. So what are some of the signs of theft or embezzlement within a practice? For one, if you are looking at your general ledger and you see unusual fluctuations where your revenue and expenses are kind of not running at what you would ordinarily expect them to be. The other thing that I'd ask all of you, and again, we can't say, I'd say let by a show of hands, but of course I can't see your hands because we're on a phone. But if I were to ask you by a show of hands, how many of you do projections and budgets for your practices? I hope that all of you do them. I can tell you that our most successful practices do them. And usually so for the upcoming year in 2017, which is our next year, we'd like to see that your projections are prepared and completed by the end of 16, so that you have a full year's worth of data to kind of look and evaluate. And the same kind of thing in terms of looking at unusual fluctuations in the ledger. You could also be looking at, gee, what is our budget versus actual performance in any particular month or period of time, and that too would give you an indication that something doesn't make sense. For sure, you'd want to look into with some, again, and what I don't want you to do is, and what I'm not suggesting is that we should walk around and not trust anybody, then kind of looking at things in that manner. But I think there does need to be a level of professional skepticism about people, and when looking at some of these signs, what we have found in interviewing our clients who have had theft occur within their practice, what they'll invariably say is, gee, yeah, gee, that didn't seem right. Or they start to put the steps together and they realize that they had just looked at things a little differently. They might have caught what was going on earlier rather than later in the game. So getting back to our list here, you should look at relationships between employees and vendors. If you see that they're overly chummy, again, you might want to take a further look at what's going on and look at some of the expenses. Beware of questionable purchases where all of a sudden, just getting back to the questionable relationship. The point being that if they're real chummy, maybe they're going to cut a deal where they're going to start buying things they don't necessarily need, or overpaying the vendor for things, and then ultimately, working some sort of kickback situation on the outside. Same thing with questionable purchases. If all of a sudden they're saying, gee, we need this new piece of equipment, new copier, new medical equipment, and when the other one is perfectly fine, again, you start to wonder why that's happening. In a situation where you're getting more patient complaints than ordinary about billing issues, I think that would be a sign of something going on. Maybe the patient is paying the money in, but because the funds didn't go into the practice, they're not reducing the amount that's owed by the patient because the bookkeeper that maybe is handling accounts receivable doesn't see the funds coming in. And so I would strongly recommend a control procedure right here, whereby if you are getting complaints from patients about their account balance being incorrect, that there's a communication to somebody other than the person that's handling accounts receivable, so that someone else is aware and you can track it. You should also be aware of increased amount of clerical errors and unusual or erratic behavior. I think that's an important thing that you should look at because, again, someone's trying to cover something up and they're starting to get, or they become defensive whenever you ask them a question. What I can also tell you is in virtually every situation where we've experienced theft within a practice's office, it's the telltale sign is that the books are never up to date. You know, it's always some sort of excuse. You know, we're having some problems. Our computer crashed. You know, I haven't been feeling well. All of these excuses. I've just been too busy. And the reason for that is, you know, people can't check on things that they can't see, right? So if you don't give us, as the accountants, if you don't give us your general ledger to look at, how could we detect something not being right? And so that's the classic cover-up, you know, keeping the books late. So you should definitely be aware of that within your own practice. I think a really good policy to have within your medical practice is that, you know, you have a hard and fast rule that the bank, and you know, banks need to be reconciled and the books need to be closed by the 10th of the following month. I mean, I know some of the hospital practices that we work with, hospital-based practices that we work with, that, you know, they have a hard closing by the 5th. So I think the 10th is certainly a fair deadline, and I think that's just, you know, it has to be a policy within your practice. Again, beware of people that don't delegate work, that they say, look, you know, they give you the classic line, basically saying, well, gee, by the time I teach her to do it, I could have done it myself. Well, no, we want, you know, the whole idea behind sharing of resources within any company is to make sure that things are done correctly, that there's more than one set of eyes looking at things, and you know, you have this kind of checks and balances system in place. Also, you look at what someone's lifestyle is all about. So if somebody's earning $30,000 as a front desk person, but you see that they're driving a really nice car and they're going on really cool vacations and they have some nice jewelry on, you know, that doesn't seem to, you know, make sense, right? So common sense would say, well, gee, how could Jane have such a, you know, a Rolex watch? Now, Jane could come from a very wealthy family. She could have been left money. Her significant other could be doing really well, and that would all make sense. But it could be that the reason why Jane has these nice things is because Jane is earning a lot more money than you really think. So just going to the next aspect of what we're talking about here is we want to kind of look at some, we want to look at the income side and try to establish some policies and procedures that might help you. So I'm going to direct you now to the flow chart that's up on your screen right now, and I think you all are familiar with this, that there are lots of various data sets or data points within a practice that will run the gamut of the experience of the patient within the practice, starting out with an entry into your appointment book, right? You're booking the appointment. They then come to the office, so they sign in. They see the doctor, so a bill is generated. Hopefully they give you money, so there's an entry in the day sheet. And then ultimately there's the billing information is processed through your billing system. And then lastly, you know, when the money comes in, it goes to the bank. So if you were to track this trail of data points or interactions, more often than not, you're going to find the appointment book through the billing entered into the system. And where the system may or may not break down is when the money comes into play, right? And so you might see the patient being billed, but the money not being entered into the day sheet, or maybe possibly not processed through your production or billing and collection report, and then ultimately not making it to the bank. So, you know, this is an important step in just terms of trying to create an audit trail. So, for sure, if you were to go through this process and do a self-audit, you know, maybe, you know, you audit 1 month's worth of transactions throughout the year, you might help you uncover whether things are working well or not. And, you know, so, and part of my objective in today's discussion is not just to help you detect theft, but also to try to implement best practices within a medical office, because it doesn't always have to be theft. Maybe somebody forgets to be billed. Maybe money gets lost within the practice where it doesn't necessarily end up in somebody's pocket. So by, you know, incorporating, you know, an audit trail, just kind of what we refer to back, what I just referred to, it's back on your screen. It might help you recover lost revenue within your practice that has nothing to do with theft. And I think the other thing by doing this self-audit, and again, one of the things that I would just add to that would be that you would want to do this on a surprise basis so that people understand that you are now creating an audit policy and procedure that they'll have to be careful of. So, just like if you drive around your neighborhood, you'll see like an ADT sign, this house is protected by ADT. And really, more often than not, that will prove as a deterrent to a burglar. I think doing these audits will be a deterrent to people that actually try to steal money from your practice, so you might want to incorporate that. You also want to review your billing and collection reports and take a look and analyze that on a monthly basis to see if there are any discrepancies or any variances from month to month. I also think it's a good idea to prepare a schedule of how much money is being billed and collected from your third-party payers so that you have, kind of an expectation as to what that should be. Within your, your computerized system, I think it's important that people use passwords and that they don't share their passwords with other people. And lastly, I think you also want to limit access to various software modules within your program so that you kind of control the administrative rights in terms of what people are actually doing within their tasks so that you can kind of limit exposure to various areas. Within your accounts receivable and billing situation or control policy, for the first thing that you want to do religiously is send statements to all of your patients. Most practices will send them out every 30 days. Some actually will do it every 2 weeks. And I think you have to do that. And what you don't want to do is have the person that's controlling accounts receivable be the one to actually mail them out. You might want somebody else mailing them out, and it should not be the receptionist. So that if the statements are generated from the system, it should be somebody that maybe is disconnected from it. Because think about it, right? If your accounts receivable is showing that Mrs. Smith didn't pay you for the month, but the receptionist Jane took the money and stuck it in her pocket, the last thing that your receptionist would want is to alert Mrs. Smith that she didn't pay her bill. So, the best idea would be to have somebody else disconnected from the loop, if you will, to mail the statements out to the patients. And again, like we talked about, following up on complaints or questions about inaccuracies within the billing. So you certainly want to investigate that. You also want to focus on situations within your accounts receivable about heavy dating, where you have an extended amount of accounts receivable that's more than, say, 30 days old. Investigate why that's happening. Again, that's a good thing to focus on irrespective of whether you're concerned about theft or not. We find that when people don't pay their bills, that might be an indication that either your just in terms of your overall management system isn't really effective. That maybe the maybe the patients aren't being credentialed properly when they're coming in. The receptionist isn't asking for money. There's a gap in the billing, people are forgetting, or there's just loose internal controls about billing. So you certainly want to focus in that area as well. And again, if you have large amounts of accounts receivable, that might be a telltale sign that money isn't making it in the door for all the reasons that we kind of referred to before. You want to have a good policy in place for refund authorization. So if you are giving a refund to a patient, I think you want to have more than one person signing off on it so that people become aware of it and that people just don't do these things arbitrarily. And then the same thing with write-offs and adjustments. I think you need to have two people looking at, well, why are we giving adjustments, or why are we writing off an outstanding balance to a patient? So again, by having this system of set your checks and balances, I think you can really help ensure that these kinds of things don't occur within your practice. And same thing, you might want to also create a schedule of funds received by the various sources, how much is by patients versus third-party payers. So as I kind of talked earlier, I spoke about earlier, is we want to have a segregation of duties within a practice if we can help it. And the idea is that no one person should have complete control over a specific area of the practice. The other thing that you want to do when people do make entries within your system, it should be identified by their initials or their employee number so that you can attribute whatever actions have occurred to the person that actually did it. Having a segregation of duties it kind of allows other employees to help correct, honest mistakes. Again, and I do believe that most people are honest, and it allows people to collaborate and work together and try to improve the policies and procedures. The other thing that's really important is that the person that handles the money within the practice should not have access to any billing and collection information. They can read the information, but they should not be able to make any kind of entries within the system. And that's the best way of preventing somebody from having the ability to override internal control policies by having the money then being able to make entries within the system. So you certainly don't want them to be in charge of collections, and you certainly don't want them to have the ability to adjust the accounts. Again, important step. Here's kind of what I would view as the ideal staffing model. And again, I know there are limitations based on the size of the practice. So you want to have the separation between your front desk, your administration, and more importantly, your accounts payable and billing and collection should be totally separate, so that the outflow of funds are handled by one set of people, and the inflow of funds should be handled by somebody else. And then you, as the administrators, the person in charge of overseeing everything, and then you're kind of acting as a liaison between the clinical and the doctors. And to me, this is the best way of, again, limiting theft within a practice. Within the banking aspect of any medical practice, you certainly want to deposit the money every day. It's very easy with checks, obviously, with scanning, and you would like to try to diversify the duties, that the person that goes to the bank isn't the person that handles the money. You should be monitoring your cash collections on a daily basis to see if there are any changes within the amounts. You have some sort of range as to what you should expect. The cash should be put away in a lockbox so that it's safeguarded and away from people who can, take the money. And as I kind of talked about earlier, you would like to have your receipts for giving receipts to people who have paid you in cash pre-numbered and then accounted for in terms of numerical sequence. In terms of your outgoing funds, in terms of financial transactions going out, bank reconciliations need to be performed monthly. You can't wait and say, gee, well, I was just too busy, couldn't get to it. I'll do 3 months together. I think it's really important that the person that writes the checks or is in charge of the banking relationship is not the person that does the bank reconciliation. Again, because that's the way someone can certainly override that internal control. So you want to separate it. The best thing is to have somebody else other than the person writing the checks doing the bank recs. Other important thing is that, I think at some level, no matter what size practice you have, the banks, there are certain documents that should go directly to the doctor or the owner of the practice unopened, bank statements being one of them. But the owner of the practice or the managing director look at the bank statements. They should look to make sure that, and we'll talk about some of the things that they should look at right now, that there are no alterations, that the numerical sequence is accounted for, and that if there is a gap in the sequence or there is a number that a manual check that cleared the bank, you should certainly investigate it and look at the microfiche copy. Again, inspecting the cancel checks to look for any names that don't seem familiar should be investigated. Again, most of us are paying our bills online now, so a good internal control procedure with regard to that would be to generate a report every time you're paying bills online, share them with the doctor, let the doctor initial them, and then let the doctor save all the printouts for the online payments that were made. And then when the bank statement comes in, the doctor can then pull out the sheets that he or she has initialed, compare the transactions that he or she has approved, and compare them to the bank statement to make sure everything is right. I don't know how many of you still have signature stamps lying around your office. I think that's a recipe for disaster. I think you're basically giving it's better than allowing somebody to forge your name where you're giving them permission, oh, just sign my name, which you should never do, by the way. Again, recipe for disaster. So if you can, I would certainly eliminate that. When you can establish a threshold within your practice that above a certain monetary denomination requires 2 signatures. Going back when we talked about how the bookkeeper gave the American Express bill, the same American Express bill, to 2 doctors. So the thing that you can do as a procedure within your office is say that only 1 doctor per month, and you designate who that doctor is the person that's going to sign checks. And then they can rotate, which is also a very good thing to kind of keep everybody honest, that a different person, if you have a multi-physician practice, you can maybe have alternating doctors sign checks every month. But again, you only have 1 sign in any particular month. And also, I can't tell you how many times I've seen, the checks, the supply of checks that come in that aren't sitting in the printer, sitting in a supply closet. I mean, so think about it. Anybody could walk into an office supply closet, take a buck of checks, put them away, and then start writing checks, forging signatures, and then just have them hit the bank. And sometimes it could even be after the employees are gone. So for sure, what you want to do is secure your checks, put them away in a safe place, and always be cognizant of what the numerical sequence is, and be aware of what's out there so that you can always account for that there's no missing checks out there. As it relates to bills that are coming in, I think it's really important to have an approved vendor list so that everybody knows, and there could be a printout given to especially the doctors as to who is allowed to receive money from our practice. And if there's a name out there that that people don't recognize, you have to investigate, well, gee, how could this person get paid when they weren't actually part of our approved list? And then the other thing I think is really good from both a deterrent of theft point of view, but also from maybe an opportunity to save some money point of view, run transaction reports by vendors, and then see how much you're paying a vendor on a monthly or annual basis. And it might give you an opportunity to maybe call up your medical supply company and say, gee, I don't know if you realize it or not, but we give you $200,000 a year, and there are other people that want business from us, and we're going to be giving your business out to bid. So what can you do in terms of give us a discount? And I would be shocked if you weren't able to get 10 or 15% discount on your bills. And so that's just a way of saving some money, irrespective of worrying about theft. The next thing I wanted to kind of go over with you is kind of, again, another flow chart about how mail should run through an office. So if we just disregard the checks, which is the green aspect of it, so typically the mail comes in to the front desk or administration. They then have to separate the mail and then give it to the various parties. So again, going back to my earlier example, the bank statements, the payroll, and also the credit card bills, I think, which is not on this chart, should go directly to the doctor and have the doctor inspect them and take a look at everything, make sure it looks correct. And part of your job is to educate the doctor on what he or she is supposed to look at so they understand better what's going on. And I know this is a pain for them. It's a pain for you to get them to do this because they're always telling you that they're too busy. But I think part of your role and our role as accountants with our clients is to, get our owners to take ownership in not just, what they like to work on, but other aspects of the practice that I think have a dramatic effect on, the practice's performance. So I think, that should go directly to them. In terms of incoming funds, the checks should come in. You make copies of them. You enter them on your daily log or your day sheet, and obviously, and then what you do is then those checks will then go to the bank by, again, somebody other than the person receiving the funds. And then what ends up flowing through to the office are just copies of the checks and the EOBs and then all the other mail that will go to you as a practice administrator. And then you can look at everything and then separate the bills that should go to your accounts payable department and your collections and deposits. Again, just copies, not the actual checks, that will then go to your accounts receivable and billing group. Other things that you should look out for besides money, which of course is the thing that we always think about first in terms of things things walking out the door. Well, what about controlled substances and drugs, right? I mean, you need to be concerned about that too. So you certainly should be keeping an inventory and of the drugs that you have, and even the samples, and they should always be safeguarded and locked in a safe place, depending upon the amount of them and the what the value is. You might even want to put in a little some sort of monitoring device to, with closed circuit TV or whatever, just to make sure people aren't walking out with things that, with a tape recorder. And also you want to limit where these things are positioned within the office, and that only certain people can go into those various rooms, so that you can kind of protect those assets of the practice that will also kind of get your practice into a lot of trouble if somebody's selling controlled, Xanax or what have you on the street, or opioids. So again, something that you want to definitely be concerned about. Some general rules of thumb about how one pays bills. Number one, you only pay on an invoice, not on a statement. You should always have some documentation in place that will that should be achieved before a bill gets paid. So if you're receiving something, some sort of material or some supplies, there should be a packing slip that will indicate that the goods were received, the date they were received, who they were received by, with a signature that's going to authenticate the actual receipt, and that the bill has been approved, that it's been math checked, and then that's how you should be doing that in terms of your payment of your bills. And then always every check must be accompanied. In other words, before the doctor signs a check, he or she has to make sure that the invoice is attached to it. Another thing that you want to look out for and have some sort of control procedures involved with is cash on hand or petty cash. Certainly we want to keep a log as to what it's being used for. You should have all the receipts for whatever is being used. I think it's important to establish a policy as to what petty cash is used for. So typically you want it to be for very small purchases, and then it should only be spent for certain things, like if you have to go buy coffee or donuts or, little denomination amounts, and you should, decide what that amount is as your petty cash balance. So, I've heard practices have things anywhere from $100 to $1,000, of course, depending on the size of the practice. I think it's also important in this situation to have one person in charge of it, so that it can't be like a he said, she said kind of thing. This way someone has responsibility. And if there is a shortage, they have to understand that they're going to have to deal with the repercussions of that. And, just like your inventory or your cash that you receive from your patients for the co-payments, petty cash should be kept in a secure place in a lockbox, so that it's not just, out there that people can get their hands on the funds. The other thing, I know we spent a lot of time talking about credit cards. Just like we have an approved vendor list, I think it would be a really good idea to keep a log or a schedule of all the credit cards that exist within the practice. So, a listing of the name of the credit card number, and then also when the credit card arrives, what the closing date is for every month. Credit card bills should be reviewed every month, and by having this log, you would also know if somehow a credit card bill didn't come. Now, that credit card bill could have not come because it was lost, or maybe somebody is holding that credit card bill. They, kind of confiscated it because there were some charges on there that they don't necessarily want you to see. And, just like, we spoke about how the focus, and I've really spoken about more how the focus could be the receptionist or the, you guys as the practice administrators. We've also seen situations where one doctor is stealing from the other one. So, a lot of times you want to have these policies and procedures to just keep everybody honest, including the doctors, because we've really seen it all happen within a practice. Within any credit card bill that you pay, you should always have all the receipts to support it. Even if it's something that was paid online, you can certainly print the confirmation of what was ordered and who it was ordered by, so that somebody's initialing it. Again, all good policies and procedures in place. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, just suggest to you, again, we don't see this a lot, but getting back to best practices, our most successful practices will have what we call a fiscal manual, which is basically an accounting manual of what everybody's job function is within a practice, how they do things, how a practice does things, from recording data, who does what, And I think it's a really good technique in terms of improving your procedures, because I think when you sit down and think about what it is that you do, then it causes you to think about why do you do it, and is it just because this is how we used to do things, or this is how we've always done them? But it helps you really think through, maybe with greater clarity as to what we should be doing, why we should be doing, and what the benefit of it is. It also serves as a wonderful training manual for new employees. And then more importantly, I think, a lot of times we're always afraid of somebody leaving, God forbid, could they get sick, they, get into an accident, or they just up and quit. Gee, how are we going to replace them? We don't know what they do. Well, if you have this manual where you have everything documented, it's a good way of making sure that you can kind of plug and play. And when you hire a replacement for somebody, they know exactly what it is that they need to do. I always say that business would be easy if it were not for people, right? So you have the people are obviously our employees, our doctors, and our patients. So in terms of trying to, safeguard the practice as best as we can, for sure we want to hire carefully. We want to carefully screen the employees' resumes, check references, and I get it. It's much harder today than ever to really get a fair assessment on an employee's performance, because companies have been sued because they've given a negative reference about an employee. So you try to find out whatever you can, and maybe you have some colleagues that you could reach out to that have been in the practice and try to find out some things off the record. Our practice will always perform background checks on everybody from a criminal and credit point of view. You might want to consider even bonding employees who have access to cash. The bonding companies will even do a better job of doing a deep dive on your employees. One of the things that we recommend to our clients, which has really been good, is to, and it's a condition of employment, that if we're going to consider somebody for employment within our practice or our clients' practices, is we want to have access. We would like you to friend us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, because we want to learn a little bit about what you do outside of the office. And I think that gives you some pretty good insight into what people do and whether that particular person is a really good hiring decision, or you can maybe possibly learn about what's going on. Also, as it relates to social networking sites, I think it's important to have a policy in place that basically says that when you work in our practice, number one, you're not allowed to mention on your Facebook account where you work. You're not allowed to mention any of the names of the people that work in our practice, any of the names of our patients, because you can imagine what goes on in some people's accounts where people within your own community could say that, the owner of the practice is the biggest jerk. We do lousy work with our patients. We don't really exhibit really good quality care of the patients. Or can you believe that, some celebrity came into our office, or famous athlete, and he or she had an STD? So you can imagine how everybody's working towards trying to create, a lifelong, lifelong effort in establishing a really great reputation for a practice, and you have one discontented employee or someone that exhibits poor judgment that could really bring the reputation of the practice down. And again, you could tell them that if we do discover that you are mentioning any of the things that I told you were forbidden, that's grounds for dismissal. The other thing that you might want to consider, depending upon the person that we're hiring in terms of their responsibilities, again, these can all be conditions of employment that not only do you do a credit check when you hire them, but you might also consider doing periodic credit checks as the year goes on or years go on. And you certainly, you want to be aware of people who refuse to take, time off. They don't want to take their vacation, or they come up with other excuses. Again, getting back to what I spoke about earlier, using the aspect of professional skepticism. I think that's an important word. Something that, just kind of draw your attention to, kind of outside the scope of today's discussion, but, your employees can steal not just from you, but they can also, or from the practice, they can steal from your patients. So as you know better than I do, your employees have access to lots of information about your employees, their name, address, social security number, date of birth, sometimes even their mother's maiden name, credit card information. So you certainly want to limit people's access to that information and have the proper control procedures in place so that people can't do this and really destroy a practice. So, you know, we kind of talked about a lot of opportunities, a lot of procedures in place. Some of these things may or may not work for your practice depending upon the size. So what would you say are some of the takeaways that you can do within your practice? I think for sure the ones that stand out most in my mind that I just want you to have as a takeaway, and we'll be available to answer questions whether it's at the end of this session or if something occurs to you a week, a month from now, you can certainly reach out. My email will be at the end of this presentation. But the takeaways, I think, is at a bare minimum, we should have the owners of the practice, again, as I said, take ownership. So the payroll, bank statements, credit cards should absolutely, I mean, it'll take all of 20 minutes a month for someone to, or, you know, a half hour a month for someone to look at the payroll reports, look at the bank statements, look at your credit cards. Definitely do that. If you can, try to separate who handles the money from who handles your accounts receivable, and also who does the bank reconciliations. And then the last thing is, you know, doing the audit trail, doing the self-audit, if you will, or engage your accountants to do it for you if you don't have the ability to do it. And, you know, doing it on a surprise basis, you know, going through a month of transactions. I think it will help you discover whether there are any issues, number one, and more importantly, serve as a deterrent so that people realize that you are checking and that you are looking at things. So one of my clients once taught me, you know, this saying, which I think is really a really good saying, which is you don't want to make it honest. Don't create an environment where you take an honest person and you make them a thief. You could see Aunt Doris here seems like a very sweet lady, but because it was just a culture of nobody checking, no internal controls, you know, she kind of had an opportunity to kind of, you know, get into things and do things that maybe she wouldn't have ordinarily have done had that, you know, that environment not existed. And that kind of sums up, you know, our presentation today. So I'm absolutely glad that you guys were able to attend. Thank you for indulging me, and I'm available to answer any questions, whether it's now or sometime in the future. Thanks.
Okay, if anybody has any questions, you can type them in the question box, and I can read them. We don't have any questions yet, so we'll just wait a couple seconds and see if anyone types any. If there are no questions, we'll close the webinar, and the presentation will be emailed out to all of the attendees and available on the website for members only.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks again, and like I said, you can certainly email me if you like.
All right. Have a good day, everyone.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.